Alright, focus. Hi, my name is Tyler Russo. Welcome to a $1 billion clown farm. Today we're painting rats. That's why I have my rat shirt on. Also, I'm on the floor because I didn't want to move my chair in for this video. It's too much work. Rats off to you. That's actually all I have to say. Here, I'll show you some rats. I started painting these as a commission for my friend Gordon about 2 months ago, who in real life is also a rat. My main goal with these was just to paint them as quickly as possible so that Gordon wasn't financially indebted to me until he died, and also so that I wouldn't have to paint rats until I died. He's kind of a two-way street, a double-edged rat, if you will. I've been painting a lot of lacquer-based paints recently. They look really good, but the back of the Mr. Hobby bottles say that you'll die before you turn 40 if you don't wear one of these. Ventilation is obviously insanely important. I should have a spray booth. Like an alcoholic father who tells his children not to drink, I will say that you should have a spray booth. Most of the painting was done just by applying contrast paints through an airbrush, so the reason why we're doing this white is so that we have something for the contrast paints to work off of, but we'll still have our brown undertone primer, and this will give us some nice shadows if we apply super thin translucent paint. After applying our lacquer white on top, I used some acrylic silver and picked out all the metallic parts. I want to use a lot of the same contrast paints that we're using for our skin to do our weathering, so applying this now before we do all the contrast paints and inks will make it so that we don't have to keep changing paints. The order in which you do things in batch painting really matters, and this is going to save us a lot of time. My main color palette inspiration for these was from Vermintide, and the Skaven in that game mostly have red tabards. The rats in that game are all covered in dirt, which is great because we can use that to be a little sloppy while painting while not having it look bad. If we overspray or spill a little bit of paint that's not supposed to be somewhere, like if I get right on the silver, I can just cover it with brown and make it look like dirt. Most model painting is approached, I think this is largely just because this is how Games Workshop paints their box art, where like everything is like a very defined clean tone of like, this is the sword, this is his hands, this is the gun, which like makes sense because that's how objects in reality work. We're not trying to emulate how things are, we're trying to emulate how things look, where a lot of things like lighting and shadow come into play that distort where the lines of things are. For example, if you look at the screenshot of Vermintide itself, like the Skaven who's in the foreground, his arm is the same color as his shoulder and they're both just like black. We want to try and emulate that look but with painting. Other things like how dirty something is, or if two things are like tonally the same value, can help us too. Painting neatly between the lines I feel like is one of the things that slows me down the most when painting. If I was obsessive with like making sure none of the fur color bled into the robes or like any of it got on the silver, this would probably take like 3 times as long. Again, our primary goal here is to not paint rats forever. I used a variety of contrast paints, inks, and speed paints. Honestly, it doesn't really matter which ones you use. I feel like how much you thin them down is more important, and I tend to not thin mine down a crazy amount, but it's probably maybe like 2/3 contrast paint, 1/3 thinner, or for inks I use like just like a tiny bit of water and mostly pretty opaque because the inks are a bit more thin. Those are the ratios I use if I'm doing something opaque. Sometimes I'll just like spray a transition color down to make the lines between 2 parts of the model more believable, like where the shoulder meets his armor I sprayed some just to have like a little bit of a gradient. But yeah, I think it's something that you just kind of have to play with and see what thinness makes sense for the particular paint you're using. There's no like golden ratio. I mean, the whole point of painting like this is to be like fast, loose, and sloppy, so I mixed all kinds of paints together in ways I can't really repeat. What matters most is if the vibe is on point or not. It doesn't matter if it's like the same kind of bestial brown or whatever paint between rats. It's like, do they look like they belong in the same universe together? Then you've succeeded if they match. I dry brushed a lot of off-white mixed with brown on these. It's a color that looks good on most parts of the model, and even if it spills onto the metallics a little bit, it's okay. And after I'd gotten them all to a point where I felt like I was pretty happy with how they looked, I then picked out some of the details that I felt like they could really benefit from having like the fine borders. This stuff is great for weathering. I use it on like basically everything. Just like the lacquer paints though, be careful because it smells a little bit, and I would like never put it through an airbrush. Foam and makeup sponges are also a great tool for creating textures, and not a lot of people use them for creating metallic specks and chipping, but I think they're also great for like brown tones and black. This yellow rust looks kind of like Skaven pee, so I applied a little bit of it everywhere. I imagine most Skaven are covered in pee, either their own or someone else's depending on their rank among the rat caste system. Anyways, here I'm just hitting the metallic areas of a sponge covered in metallic paint over and over again. I straight up got a ton on his face, which I think is a little more bleeding of color than I'm willing to forgive, but that's okay. We can just cover it in more rat pee later. Taking a little foam sponge and putting color everywhere adds a lot though. I would highly recommend trying it with all sorts of colors. Brown and black work the most for these guys, but I think you could use this to generate textures on basically anything if you want it to be not completely flat. After doing the silver, I dry brushed some more white and off-white on on, it's these two mixed together. This covers up the silver areas that are less egregious pretty well. And like all dry brushing, raises the edges of the sculpt so that the detail of the model itself looks good and does a lot of work for you. I tried to do this the most in places I want people's attention to be drawn to, which is mostly their heads and sometimes the shields, because in general people look at the brightest spots of the model first. Continued to apply some washes by hand and started looking at a lot of John Blanche art. His color palette is pretty similar to where we're going towards. He uses a lot of like splattery brush strokes and textures, and also different parts of his subjects tend to blur together, which is great because that's what we're doing too. Contrast paints and inks tend to have like kind of an ugly pooling effect that looks bad if it's like not done deliberately, but I tried to use it in a way where we're using the texture like it's a Blanche painting kind of, and experimenting with having brush strokes be visible in general. Once I was feeling confident with how the little rats looked, I started on some of the characters in the army. I didn't want to start any of the centerpiece models until I had an idea of what I was doing, and by the time I finished the storm vermin, I felt like I had a good idea for like the color scheme, the texture, the style, and how the army would look together when it was done. Skaven are a fun army to get gross with. I experimented with putting all sorts of like yellowing and weird hues into the skin tone that don't feel natural and look diseased and fucked up. Something I've been doing a lot over the past 3 years is having like a really bright focal point that feels clean to contrast all the muddy dirtiness of the rest of the model. Some models have a really obvious place for a light source, some you kind of have to make it up. This guy fortunately has this giant like flame pillar on his back, which I thought would be a great place to put some like warpstone looking green glow. And he also has this little warpstone crystal generator here, which I want to make a slightly darker color than the flame so that it doesn't look like it's the exact same texture, but pretty similar otherwise. I use high flow fluorescent paint from golden acrylic for the brightest green, and then I use this like AK dark green for like the shadows and the far extremes of the flame. Their bases were covered with just like a mixture of different sizes of sand, and I used a mix of like 50% ink and about 50% primer, maybe a little more primer than ink, to coat them all black. This is the first test model I did for the bases. I really like how the bases look, but I feel like they take a little too long with the method I'm using here, so since I've been experimenting with like just using more normal acrylics, and I don't worry super much about getting a little bit on their feed, since ultimately we're going to use weathering powder and it's going to get messy and go over the feed and like the bottom parts of the model anyways. So this basing method just consists of taking a bunch of different hues of brown weathering powder and kind of going crazy with them. You don't want to mix them all together, you want them to like stand out from each other, so I do like spots of like an orange, spots of like a gray, spots of a dark brown, and when I'm done I cover them in Gamsol that I put in the spray bottle. Thankful and Bone Rip I mostly painted on their own, but the other 3 big centerpiece models I painted together. Even for models as big as this, for me it's still easier to batch paint. Everything I did is basically the same. Start with the lacquer paint for the Xenophal, then I spray some contrast paint on, still using a lot of splattery brown and black tones, still trying to emulate a kind of Blanchitsu style and go for more like shadows and implying things. And because we have more surface area to work with here and our models are going to be a little more important, I spent a lot more time experimenting and going crazier with them. If you're painting an army with a bunch of little guys and a couple of big guys, if your big guys look bad, the whole army will look bad, even if the little guys are painted really well. And if your little guys are bad but your big guys are painted well, then your little guys will still look good, because people will just like see the big thing and kind of assume your little stuff is painted well too. But just like how it works when you're judging models from like 6 feet away. I realized too late, but I never actually got some proper lightbox photos of this army before handing it back to Gordon, so instead please enjoy some very shaky shots of them in my fridge that I shot for a bit. This is only the first like quarter or so of the Skaven he's given me. I think there's like 10,000 points in here. I don't know how many, but it just feels like infinite Skaven. So I'll probably do at least 1 more, if not 2 more follow-up videos whenever I finish a new chunk. He also needs somebody to play against, so I'm gonna finish painting my Gloomspike kits when not on mushrooms this time. It probably took me like 10 days working full-time-ish to get to this point, but now that I've got a color scheme established, I feel like the next batch is gonna go way faster. In the future, I probably won't use weathering powder for their bases either. It looks really good, but it slows down the process, and I think I can do something pretty similar just through like dry brushing. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you like me or Skaven, you could subscribe. Yeah, other YouTube engagement stuff. I also just took 2 Stompas to your tournament and it went way better than I thought, so I'm gonna make a video on that too. Yeah, thanks for hanging out, thanks for coming by, see you in the next one. Goodbye.